Foundations of Biblical Hebrew Lesson Number 1. Modern Jewish Cultural and Linguistic Divisions. These divisions are based essentially on the dispersion of the children of Israel, especially after the time of 70 AD and throughout the period from 70 AD to present, and the different cultural and linguistic adaptations that occurred in these different, somewhat separated groups. In each of these groups, there's slightly different pronunciation of Hebrew words, which would be important for this class. And there are some slightly different cultural expressions and practices. One of the largest of these divisions is the Ashkenazi, or the Ashkenazic Jews. That is made up of the Jewish communities originating in the area of Germany, and it would include areas of Central and Western Europe as well. Ashkenaz is the medieval Hebrew word for the region that comprises Germany and the areas that surround Germany. So when we talk about Ashkenazic Jews, the title is used for them because these are the Jews who were predominantly settled in the area of Germany in what was the Germanic Empire. The dialect of the Ashkenazic Jews is Yiddish. So when you hear about Yiddish, that is a dialect that originated among the Ashkenazic Jews. Most of the Jews in the United States are believed to be Ashkenazic Jews, or Ashkenazi. And there are believed to be somewhere between 8 and 11.25 million Ashkenazi Jews presently. The second one of these cultural and linguistic groups that the Jews are divided up into in the present are sometimes referred to as the Sephardi, or the Sephardic Jews. These are communities that originated in the Iberian Peninsula, and of course that includes Spain and Portugal. Sepharad is the modern Hebrew name for Spain, so just like with the Ashkenazic Jews, this denotes a geographical locality. The main area where groups that would be considered part of a Sephardic type of a cultural or linguistic group of the Jews would be located would be in the area of Spain and in the surrounding countries. Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazic Jews have slightly different pronunciations of several Hebrew vowels and at least one Hebrew consonant. So individuals from these different communities or these different backgrounds would have somewhat of a different way of pronouncing a number of words. The Sephardic pronunciation of the Hebrew language is the pronunciation that's used primarily in modern Israel, and it's considered by most of the scholars to be closer in sound to the ancient biblical pronunciation. So in other words, many of the scholars today believe that the Sephardic pronunciation is probably closest to what the words sounded like in their original form, in the form that they were pronounced during the time of the writing of the Bible. There are believed to be approximately 1.5 to 2 million Sephardic Jews today, so this is a much smaller group than the Ashkenazic Jews. The third one of these groups is the Mizrahi, which are Jewish communities that originate in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Caucasus. The Hebrew word Mizrahi means eastern, so these are the Jews that were geographically more eastern in their location. There is a lot of overlap between the Mizrahi and the Sephardic Jews, and that sometimes causes them to be grouped together as one singular group in the minds of some people. There are believed to be approximately 4 million Mizrahi Jews presently. The reason it's important to understand these three differences in terms of these cultural groupings is because it affects the way that we might pronounce Hebrew words, and we would have to determine which type of pronunciation we're going to use of vowels and some even consonantal sounds when we're pronouncing words based on which one of these pronunciations we want to use. This also relates to something else that's very important, and that is that it is very difficult for us to know for certain what the original biblical Hebraic pronunciation was. To try to determine exactly how some of the words were pronounced in the era when the Bible was being written is not as easy as it might appear. The Hebrew language is not a language that has continued in one singular unbroken form for the last 2,000 years. It is a language that is adapted in ways. It's adapted in pronunciations. It's adapted in some of the words and vocabulary that are used that were not found in the biblical period. And the modern Hebrew language that is spoken today in Israel is a recreation of the biblical language, taken primarily from what amounts to the biblical language and some of the cultural expressions that were carried forward through the communities of the Jews that existed during the period from the writing of the Bible to the modern day. So we have to be very careful, and I'm going to be fairly general when I'm pronouncing Hebrew words, pronounce them in a way that is probably the most common pronunciation. With some words, there are several potential ways to pronounce them, but I'll use the most common pronunciations, or the ones I believe are the most biblical pronunciations. But again, I want to stress that trying to determine a perfect pronunciation is very difficult with the Hebrew language because, as you can see, there have been at the very least several different communities of Jews who have different pronunciations, different traditions regarding their language, and it's important to understand that as a basis before you try to learn Hebrew from a biblical perspective. Because that is what we're doing in these classes. We're attempting to learn Hebrew from a biblical perspective. Not just modern Hebrew. We'll include some modern Hebrew conversational vocabulary in this, but the primary purpose is to learn biblical Hebrew, which means we're trying to get as close as possible to what we believe the proper pronunciation of the letters would be, the words would be, the consonants would be. So that will be our goal throughout.